Thank you for joining us today. My name is Allison Van, and I'm the Executive Director at SPARK, a Center for Social Research Innovation. Welcome to today's SPARK Talk, Participant Observation, Observant Participation, and Hybrid Ethnography. I'd like us to begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who are here before us and recognize our responsibility to respect and honor the intimate relationship that Indigenous peoples have to this land. We're thrilled to welcome Josh Siem, who's an Assistant Professor of Sociology at Boston College, where he primarily teaches courses in social theory and ethnographic methods. He's the author of Bandage, Sort, and Hustle, Ambulance Crews on the Front Lines of Urban Suffering. Thank you so much for joining us today, Josh.
Thank you very much for having me. Is it okay if I share my screen? Looks like I have permission
Yeah.
to do this. Okay, I have a PowerPoint. Okay. Thank you. You all can see that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all for coming and listening to me. Let me move some screens around so I know what's going on here. This one up here. So I'm going to talk today about a paper I published in Sociological Methods and Research in 2021 called Participant Observation, Observant Participation, and Hybrid Ethnography. And I start that paper by asking a question that I think all ethnographers should be concerned with, which is how much should ethnographers involve themselves with the people, places, and processes that they study? So I think of ethnography as a method of tension, if not a method of contradiction, because it involves this awkward union of participation and observation. And sorry, let me see on my screen here. And so one answer to this question about how much an ethnographer should become involved with the people, places, and processes that they study has become increasingly popular or increasingly common, which is to invert the standard method of participant observation into what some are calling observant participation. So observant participation is often framed as a more intensive and sometimes even a kind of heterodox form of ethnography. So where the participant observer tends to invent and to occupy a kind of temporary and largely peripheral role in the field, it's like a hanging around or somebody who's shadowing somebody else to observe the social life of others. The observant participator occupies a pre-existing and a more integrated role to the field and to study that social universe. So it references the lessons learned through active participation. So this is called different things. So sometimes observant participation is called embodied ethnography. Sometimes it's called inactive ethnography or even carnal sociology. It's not, however, autoethnography, which is a method that mixes social analysis with autobiographical and retrospective reflection. That's a legitimate method, and it's one I think that we should respect in the social sciences. But what I'm calling observant participation is different because observant participation, like participant observation, but perhaps unlike autoethnography, involves purposeful field work of going in and occupying a pre-existing role to learn that given social universe. I think many people will label their projects as autoethnography when I think that they should probably better label them as observant participation. But however we call it, we can find observant participators in a number of studies. They have existed as fashion models, as boxers, as cops, as farm workers, as casino card dealers, wildlife firefighters, jail inmates, and even jailhouse doctors. Now, I think it's reasonable to ask the question as to why anybody would ever want to do ethnography like this. If you want to study casino capitalism, why would you become a casino card dealer like Jeffrey Salaz? Why not just observe casino card dealings and interactions as somebody who shadows those workers or is observing them perhaps even covertly as a consumer or I guess if you're a consumer, you would be participating in the action. So and the question is, why would you become a casino card dealer? Why would you become an active participant in the field rather than just observe more from the sidelines? There's a few answers provided in the literature when they tend to emphasize this issue of depth. So the argument is frequently made that observant participation provides a deeper form of field work than participant observation. And there's a couple of justifications for this. Many have argued that observant participation can bring you deeper into private spaces. And some draw on the work of Irving Goffman to emphasize this, arguing that observant participation brings you essentially further backstage, exposing you to more candid talk and less public practices that would be otherwise harder to access, perhaps not impossible, but harder to access by way of participant observation. And the other kind of depth here is one that draws not on Goffman, but frequently on the writing of Pierre Bourdieu, to argue that observant participation provides a deeper inquiry into habitus or into disposition more generally. And so here, observant participators often think about this with respect to, like, when you enact the practices that you're studying, you begin to unveil a sort of unspoken truths and tacit knowledge that, again, might not be impossible with participant observation, but might otherwise be difficult. Now, in general, I don't disagree with these framings. I do think it's fair to say that observant participation deepens fieldwork in this way relative to participant observation. I am, however, simply not convinced that observant participation is somehow empirically, let alone morally, superior to participant observation, though many would argue that. Deepening fieldwork, in my view, comes with its own trade-offs. And few studies, to my knowledge, acknowledge the sort of trade-offs between those different strategies, and also consider the merits of mixing them into what I call a hybrid approach. What I want to do today in outlining this paper that I published is talk about the differences between participant observation and observant participation, to move beyond somewhat simplistic discussions of depth, not sufficient to say, oh, observant participation is simply deeper than participant observation because it gives you more backstage access or more insight into the habitus. That might be true, but I think that in itself is not a very fruitful account of what that's at stake here. So I want to detail what's different between participant observation and observer participation, and then also consider what can be gained by mixing them into a hybrid strategy. And what I'll argue is that there's stakes here, and these stakes go beyond the simplistic discussions of depth. So first, there's an issue of field positioning. Participant observation and observant participation provide differences with respect to field positioning, where participant observation provides more opportunities for mobile positioning in the field, where observant participation tends to have more fixed positioning. Each come with their trade-offs. They also have or provide different opportunities and emphasis for an analytic gaze. So participant observation tends to have an outward gaze, there to study the world of others, whereas observant participation tends to bend that ethnographic gaze back onto the self as you make sense of your own shifting dispositions as you learn to enact these practices under study. And then finally, there's an issue at stake here with respect to data assembly, like how the ethnographic material is constructed, where participant observation lends itself to strategies of inscription, where you jot notes and then take jottings in the field and then expand them into lengthier field notes. Observant participation tries to treat the body as its own sort of fleshy tablet for learning the experiences in the field. So where participant observation gives us inscription, observant participation gives us incarnation. So to detail this, I'm going to draw a bit on my own work. And then again, I'm going to shamelessly plug my book, Bandage, and Hustle, Images in the Frontlines of Urban Suffering, because this paper that I published is actually initially going to be part of the methodological appendix, but the appendix got to be too large. And I was concerned that if some of these ideas were thrown into appendix, that nobody was going to read them. So I pulled them out of the appendix, made a more bare bones appendix for the book, and published this article as a methods piece. And this is a case study, a 2-year ethnography of a private 911 ambulance firm in California. And in that study, I spent a year doing ride-along observations. I was a participant observer. So I spent many days and many nights in seats like that. So it's a seat actually above the gurney. So I was able to sit there and watch ambulance crews interact with their patients and take detailed notes as they did it. And as part of this, I was also able to shadow middle managers. So these are they're called field supervisors. They drive around in SUVs and they patrol the 911 ambulance fleet. And I was also able to attend a number of management meetings. So I did that all for about a year. And in my second year of field work, I positioned myself as an EMT, as a novice emergency medical technician at the same company. I was a paid employee at the same company for 9 months. There's about about 3 months of preparation before I could actually begin employment there. So it's about a year of observant participation and a year of participant observation. That's a picture of me driving an ambulance. And the project is a study of how ambulance crews contribute to the governance of poverty and suffering in the capitalist and racist city. And the theoretical intervention I make in that book project is one regarding the labor process. I argue that the best way to understand the sort of governance of poverty and suffering in the city is to study the frontline workers and more particularly the frontline labor process of the institutions that's managing these people and managing their problems. So I take a labor process approach, and you can't understand any labor process without having an explicit concern for the social relations of production. So this, of course, means accounting for the social relations between ambulance crews and the subjects of their work, their patients, but it also means accounting for the relations between ambulance crews and their managers, those who are having to control and coordinate their labor from above, as well as relations they have with other workers, not only other ambulance workers, but also other workers who share their clientele, including emergency department nurses and police on the streets. And so the book is organized in such a way where I'm detailing all these different relations and thinking about how they interlock and inform one another by way of a study of the labor process. And in this methods piece, in making sense of the trade-offs between participant observation and observant participation, I focus on these different relations and show how I was able to examine them uniquely by drawing on both participant observation as a ride-along and also observant participation as a novice emergency medical technician. So what I want to do is provide some insights into some of those social relations of production by thinking about some of what's at stake here between participant observation and observant participation. So first, I want to talk about field positioning, which, as I mentioned, participant observation provides more mobile positioning, whereas observant participation provides more fixed positioning. Okay, so as a participant observer, I was able to move about the field with not total liberty, but with quite a bit of latitude. So I was able to shadow almost any crew that I wanted to, so long as the crew was willing to let me into their ambulance, and nobody I approached said no to me unless they had somebody already in the ambulance as a ride along, a medical student or something like that. So I was able to shadow pretty much any crew I wanted. I could choose day shifts, night shifts, weekends, weekdays. And I also got an opportunity to do ride alongs with managers, middle managers, attend management meetings. So I had a lot of mobility as a participant observer. Then I became an EMT. I be positioned into this more fixed location in labor in this study. But this provided its own unique benefits because what I lost in breadth, I gained in depth. I was barred from the supervisor rig. I was no longer allowed to attend management meetings, but I gained a more intimate knowledge of the ambulance and of its ambulance crews. And crews were more candid with me, many of them even admitting that they were more candid with me once I became a worker. Less concerned with me, for example, sharing their thoughts with management. This was not really clear to me when I was a participant observer, but apparently there was some suspicion as I was going one day hanging out with management and the next day hanging out with labor, that there was a concern that like maybe he's sharing information. Even though I told them I wasn't, there was some of that concern. But once I became a worker, a lot of those concerns dissolved because I wasn't allowed to go to management meetings anymore anyways. So I think thinking about the trade-off here of field positioning in this mobile and fixed trade-offs was really useful for me understanding the relationships between labor and management. So the mobility of participant observation exposed me to these three layers: labor, middle management, and upper management. And in that part of the study, I learned about the company's efforts to intensify labor exploitation by deploying what I call a lean fleet, basically an ambulance fleet that was minimally wasteful, highly flexible, and very efficient. So I hung out with middle managers, I hung out with supervisors as they scolded labor and softly pressured them to work harder. And then I also hung out with labor on the other side of these struggles as they struggled against managerial pressures in various ways. So that mobility was useful, no doubt. But so too was the fixed positioning of being an EMT, because workers, as I mentioned, were more trusting of me. And they also, it necessitated, because I was actually doing the practice of the work, it necessitated that they taught me a lot, that they would teach me a lot of things that they otherwise didn't feel was necessary to even tell me about. So they had to teach me the little secrets of class struggle. So little secrets on how to confuse management on how hard we were actually working, to confuse them on how much, a lot of things that were just taken for granted. But once you become a worker, you have to learn these things as part of an initiation. So we had to write paperwork in such a way that sort of confused management in terms of how much work we actually did. And these weren't things that I thought that labor was hiding from me as a ride along. They just were things that they didn't think were relevant to bring up to me. They weren't even relevant to really articulate to anyone beyond just the novice worker who needs to learn them at the point of initiation. So thus there's a trade-off in these fixed positions and studying these relations between labor and management. And this hybrid approach allowed me to leverage the strengths of a fixed positioning against the weaknesses of a mobile positioning and vice versa. And then there's this issue of what I call the analytic gaze. Participant observation presents more opportunities for outward gaze. Not to say that you can't do inward gazing and have reflexivity, but it's a method designed primarily to observe the social realities, the social world of others. And indeed, that's what I did. As a ride along, I mostly focus on the world of others: workers, patients, cops, nurses, managers, and so on. I focus on, quote, their world. As an observer participator, there was more opportunities for inward gaze as I, quote unquote, became an EMT to learn about my personal yet socially relevant experiences in the field, looking inwardly onto myself as I became an EMT. For this, in the article, I detail how this was really beneficial for me understanding the relations between ambulance crews and their patients. So as a participant observer, I learned in this outward gazing, I learned of this folk distinction that ambulance crews made between what they called legit cases and bullshit cases. So the legit cases were seen as like the real 911 emergencies that necessitated the sort of craft of paramedicine. And these were relatively rare. And this is, of course, on a continuum. And then the bullshit cases were seen as cases that were ill matched with the ambulance. They didn't have crews exercising their craft and often were seen as a sort of violation of their vocation, simple taxi trips to the hospital and things like that. And I observed in my outward gazing that this tended to correspond, not perfectly, but it tended to correspond to some differences in struggle and solidarity between ambulance crews and their patients. So there was more solidarity, a sort of Durkheimian organic solidarity of interdependence during the so-called legit cases, where patients, of course, need ambulance crews in those cases to live, but the crews also need those legitimate patients to realize their craft and their sense of vocation. And there was more struggle, more tension and conflict in these so-called bullshit cases. And they were a mismatch between what patients thought that the ambulance should be providing them and what workers thought they were even capable or interested in providing them. This outward gazing provided me great insight into these types of dimensions of the crew patient relation. But as an observant participator, as a novice emergency technician, I was able to better understand the temperaments and the cognitive frames that ambulance crews acquire to navigate their interactions with patients. As I detail in the article, but also in the book, there were sort of two sets of dispositions that I noticed emerging within me as I became an EMT. And so one set of dispositions I call being a dick, having cold and apathetic sentiments and cold and apathetic interactional styles with patients. And then the other set of dispositions was one I called having heart, which was a more sympathetic and at times even empathetic orientation to patients. So as quote unquote being a dick, and this is language I'm lifting from the participants themselves. And I was trained in part to be a dick. I have a part in the book where my trainers were telling me to do this explicitly, where you learn to speak bluntly, to yell at obnoxious patients, to even threaten disobedient ones, and to do things that I am at this point in my a little bit embarrassed of. But it was something that was a necessary requirement to navigating that work site. And then I also acquired this more warm, empathetic, and sympathetic issue of having heart and finding real emotional reward from helping people. And I noticed that this was imperfectly patterned. That being a dick tended to correspond to the bullshit cases. No, not perfectly, but it tended to correspond with that, while having heart tended to correspond to the legit case. And so I was able to make sense of these dispositions in conversation with others as I became an EMT. So again, there was a trade-off where participant observation presented more opportunities for this outward gazing, allowing me to understand sort of breadth of these different understandings that ambulance crews had about their patients. And observant participation provided more depth as I was able to make sense of my own shifting dispositions. One might even say my shifting habitus if I did this. Okay. Sorry, I lost my cursor. Okay. So then the last stake I want to talk about is one of data assembly, where participant observation presents more opportunities for inscription, of jotting notes and then detailing them later through more detailed writing once you're out of the field or out of the social encounter. And observant participation presents more opportunities for incarnation. So as a participant observer, as a ride-along, I took lots of notes. In fact, it was almost expected of me to take lots of notes. That was my task for the day. I was there as a PhD candidate to study ambulances as a ride-along. And I think if I wasn't taking notes, somebody probably would have thought I was being a bit weird and perhaps even being lazy or wasting their time. I took lots of jottings in the field. As an observant participator, as an EMT, I took far less notes in the field because the ambulance needed my hands to steer the ambulance, to lift the gurney, to clean equipment. So I came home after my EMT shifts with far less notes. But I was able to make a sort of a virtue out of necessity because I was able to treat my own embodied experiences as a novice emergency medical technician as a form of field note or as a form of data assembly. So there became this process of incarnation to be counterposed to this issue of inscription. In the article, I detail how this was useful in particular for making sense of the relations between the ambulance crews and their police and nurse counterparts. So as a participant observer, as a ride-along, just shadowing ambulance crews, I became really interested in these relations between these workers. And I focused heavily in the project on conflict, on the tension between them, but I want to be clear that they weren't always in conflict with one another. There actually was a fair amount of solidarity between these different emergency workers. But there was conflict, and I thought the conflict was really interesting because it could reveal different boundaries and things like that. So I do focus on conflict, but I'm always careful. I want to make sure that nobody ends here thinking that the nurses and the police and the ambulance crews are constantly arguing with one another. They're not, but they're arguing frequently enough to where it became interesting to focus on. And as a participant observer doing this sort of process of inscription, I was able to jot notes of these conflicts, sometimes as they were happening, or at least immediately afterwards. And was able to capture in pretty granular detail what was said, who said what was like at stake, and what was at issue here. Because a lot of the conflicts, they were subtle, they were quick, and so the details really mattered. And so being a participant observer and being able to jot notes in the field to capture these conflicts, to capture the nuances of these relations was really useful. And then I became an EMT. And here I argue that my field notes shifted from being more about a field diary. So I would come home and I always wrote every time I got off work, not that day, but the next day, I would always write about the shift. But I'd have less notes to go on. I'd have some I take during breaks and things like that, but I had far less notes. But the field diary, as I called it, became useful in a different way because it became a template or it became a platform for me to write about the more emotional and cathartic experiences of actually reflecting on the work. It just provided a different layer of insight as I reflected on what I said in these conflicts, because now I was a part of the conflicts with the police and the nurses, but also focus on what I wish I would have said, my aspirations of what I'm going to say next time somebody else irritates me in the field like this. And that provided, I think, unique insights of incarnation of drawing on my embodied experiences that were otherwise not visible to me as a participant observer. So again, there was a trade-off. I had more thorough jottings as a participant observer, but a deeper understanding of the embodied experiences as an observant participator through this process of incarnation. So with this in mind, I think there are three motivations for what I call hybrid ethnography, of mixing participant observation with observant participation in a single study. So you're able to mix mobile positioning and fixed positioning, outward gazing and inward gazing, and inscription and incarnation, and you're able to leverage the strengths of one method against the weaknesses of the other across these different, what I call stakes. But I want to be really clear here. In no way am I suggesting to you all that this is the only way to do fieldwork. I'm not here to push a hybrid or bust argument. I think hybrid ethnography is actually, in the way that I describe it, is exceptionally hard to do because it requires opportunities for both participant observation and observant participation. And sometimes getting the opportunity to do just one of those things is hard. So to have a project that gives you the opportunity to do both of them is often very difficult. And also, it's the case that there are certain practices, as others have noted, that are sometimes too dangerous, too risky, or otherwise too inaccessible. Becoming an EMT in the United States, particularly in the state of California, only required a 6-week boot camp and some additional trainings, CPR trainings, and things like that. So it's easy to do low or easy to access practices this way. I couldn't become a brain surgeon and do it. So if I wanted to do an ethnography of brain surgery, it would probably make more sense to do participant observation than observant participation, let alone an effort to mix them. So I'm not here to suggest that you need to do both of these strategies. And I think that there are also other things to consider, including sequences. So I go from participant observation to observant participation, but one could consider what it might mean to go in the other direction or to oscillate between the two strategies. So I do think that there are some additional questions to answer there. And so again, not pushing a hybrid or bus argument. And I think far more importantly than detailing the benefits of hybridity here, what I think is far more important is to detail the differences between participant observation and observant participation and to clarify the distinction between the two forms of fieldwork and to be explicit about what the trade-offs are between them. But with that, I think I'll end it and look forward to a good conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we have lots of time to talk, which I'm really excited about. I will first open it up to everyone who is participating. If anyone has a question, feel free to just speak up, or you can also put it in the chat and I'm happy to read it out.
Hi, maybe I can start. No questions, but thank you so much for this learning experience. And we learned so much about the difference in methods between participant observation and observation participation. So that's pretty cool. And then this hybrid ethnography. Yeah, it's a really nice approach. And I hope to read your paper since it's out already. If you put the citation there, I'd love to read that.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
While others are pulling their thoughts together, I'm really curious about what this meant in terms of making that transition relative to probably some of the EMTs knowing you from your participant observation role, maybe some of them not, and then also the management response to that transition. I can imagine that I think I would have been tempted, um, although I totally understand the ethical issues of this, to be on a crew that like didn't know me when I
Mhm.
went into the observant participator role. So I'm really curious about what it meant for the people around you that switch over.
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually initially wasn't even my idea. So it was actually management's idea, or well, maybe I shouldn't say management. It was a supervisor's idea. I was doing ride-alongs for about getting close to the year mark, and uh, my wife lost her job, and so there was a point where I needed to make more money. So I was riding around with. I mean, supervisors are a smaller group, so I actually got to know the supervisors quite well. And I was on a night shift with a supervisor. When I was venting, like, "Oh man, it's too bad. I'm gonna have to probably either cut back on field work quite a bit, or I'm not going to be able to do field work for much longer because I need to go teach some classes and pay rent." And he was kind of like, "You should just be you should just be an EMT here." He was like, "You'll learn a lot more about it." And I had already actually had the license to be an EMT. I went to the EMT boot camp not initially to become an EMT as much as to learn the vocabulary and that so I had a sense of I treated it as a language training in some sense. I even had my PhD program pay for it with the funding that they use to pay for language training. I made the argument for students to learn Spanish before they go to Mexico. Let me learn this professional language before I go do this case study. So he knew that I had done that training. And this is a job because it's private EMS that doesn't pay very good money. There's a difference between EMTs and paramedics. So EMTs are the entry level ones that do a lot of the support for paramedics. So I wasn't intubating anybody. I wasn't starting IVs. I was there mostly to EMTs and 911 systems are mostly there to augment the duties of paramedics, especially in California. So I felt like I was capable of, especially after a year of watching people do it, I felt like I was able to make that transition. I did, however, before doing it, I was just to say, because it's a low wage job, there's a lot of turnover. And so they frequently need EMTs. So they were, that's when that supervisor was like, we need people to fill these shifts. So it'd be great if you just weren't riding along, but also working. I didn't survey or do any census of the whole organization on what their thoughts were on this, but I did talk to a number of workers, and every worker I talked to was in support of this idea of me becoming a worker. I talked to so this was a middle manager that was idea was I talked to upper management and asked if they also thought that this was appropriate and something that would be reasonable. And they said that they also thought it was fine. So long as I knew that I was no longer able to attend management meetings, and so long as I knew I was no longer able to do ride alongs with supervisors. So it was interesting. And when I went up for the interview, the collective interview process is almost not unlike when you get interviewed to be a professor, whereas like the workers were doing a lot of the interviews and there was a panel of workers. And it was weird because they all knew me because I had done ride alongs. So they
Yeah.
all knew me by name. And in the interview, they're asking me questions like, where do I see myself in 5 years? And I was just explicit. Look, I just want to do the research and I take this away for you to make money, but also continue to do research. They were all cool with it. But even though I was only there for 9 months, after a few months, and I should say I didn't know everybody. So I would work some shifts where I had done ride-alongs with people before, but also some shifts where I hadn't done ride-alongs with people, but they knew me as somebody who was around the area. They'd seen me around, and some who did not know me at all. I always introduce every shift, even the ones that I worked as an EMT. I always, if you don't know them, you ask a bit about them. As a part-timer, I worked with different paramedic partners. And I always told every paramedic that I worked with that I was there to work and to do good work, but also there as part of my doctoral dissertation. So everybody knew, even under those conditions, that I was a worker, and that or that I was a researcher. And toward the end, that became more important because there was so much turnover of this organization that there was a point in which I became more senior than a number of workers. And toward the end, they even pulled me in to do some training for some of the new EMTs, which I felt very strange about because I hadn't been there for very long, but I was doing equipment training and stuff like that towards the end. Yeah, it was an interesting transition and one that was really an opportunity that presented itself to me by way of these other workers and even managers. Yeah, does that answer your question? Is there something else? I can't remember if there's something else you wanted me to touch on.
No, that totally answers the question.
Yeah.
I'll pause a minute and then I've got another one if others
Oh,
don't.
yeah.
I always have a million questions. Natasha.
Hello. So my name's Natasha. I'm a PhD student at McMaster in sociology. And I'm also interested in the governance of urban poverty and what that kind of looks like. So before I get into my question, I just wanted to say thanks so much for sharing your research with us today. As someone who is also considering doing a form of participant observation or some version of an ethnography, this definitely sparked my interest. So my question for you today was, as I gear up to writing my proposal and start figuring out where my research will fall, I was just wondering if you had any advice or tips for someone who is considering a form of participant observation or ethnography for their dissertation.
Yeah. Good question. It's nice to meet you. Yeah. It's hard to say, I think, because you probably the tips matter knowing specifically like, what kind of project one is working on. But I think as a general tip that I give to students, and one that I think is useful, especially at the proposal writing stage, is I think it's really critical to engage deeply with the existing literature and the existing theories that are out there. I don't subscribe generally to a grounded theory approach, especially not traditional grounded theory as articulated by Glasser and Strauss. Um, I subscribe more towards the extended case method approach. And I think one of the benefits of that is that you immerse yourself deep within theory, deep within the literature, and then you kind of develop a set of hypotheses or predictions. And then you go into the field very willing to ditch those hypotheses and predictions to reconstruct them. So I did the study initially. It started as not, I knew it was going to be about poverty. I knew it was going to be about suffering because the literature told me that. But I started it initially at the ride along phase as a study of more narrowly on trauma work. I was really interested in trauma in a medical sense of injury. Because when I went to the EMT boot camp, half of the curriculum was on trauma emergencies and the other half was on medical emergencies. So trauma, gunshots and motor vehicle collisions, broken bones, all that stuff. And I thought that was interesting theoretically because there was a lot out there on the social determinants of injury, including the social determinants of traffic collisions and injuries, because so much of it, in terms of how injured you are, depends not only on just the type of dense neighborhood you're in, but also in terms of the kind of vehicle you have and the kinds of safety that you have in your vehicle, and there's airbags and seat belts and things like that. But I thought there wasn't enough on what these workers were dealing with and how they were handling injury. So I developed my entire proposal around this issue of trauma work, that it was going to be more narrowly within poverty governance on trauma work. And when I began the field work, that's how I pitched it to the people that let me into the field. That's how I pitched it to the people I did ride-alongs with. And I got the impression after a few days that people were laughing at me because most of the ambulance calls are not traumatic, and most of them are not for severe trauma. So a lot of them, even when they are trauma, are for low severity trauma, like a sprained ankle or something like that. So they weren't for the severe trauma. So people were teasing me. They were saying I had come for blood, and they thought that I was going to be doing. There was at the time there was this TV show called Trauma that was about ambulance crews that was panned as being absolutely ridiculous, and everybody hated it in the field, and everybody made fun of it. And so I thought people were making fun of me in that respect. And I realized that I would spend entire shifts shadowing people and realize I wouldn't see any trauma. I had to change it to thinking about what these workers are actually doing. And this is developed more into the poverty governance stuff. It meant completely ditching the proposal. None of that writing in the proposal made it into the dissertation because I completely ditched all that focus on trauma. But it was still, I don't think of it as wasted labor, because I still think of it as that was the necessary step to give me focus to go into the field. I think you have to have focus. There's an infinite manifold of signals and things that you encounter in the field. You have to have some frameworks to begin to make sense of it. And then you just have to be willing to reconstruct those frameworks. So I was constantly in the field, but also with the literature. So I was just constantly looking for new theories to make sense of things. And another one so this was like a constant process. And at one point I turned to Bordusian field theory because, oh, this is it. This is going to be a Bordusian field theory stuff, especially in making sense of the relations between ambulance workers and the police. And then I realized that actually it didn't make a ton of sense to do that, because maybe not so much for Bourdieu, but some of these larger stuff about social constructions of problems and things like that, they were giving me theories about that the police are out there constantly criminalizing people's problems, that they're out there to expand their jurisdiction of criminal justice, and that medical workers, a la Peter Conrad and others, are there to expand their medical jurisdiction. So I thought what's going to happen is that ambulance crews and cops, and this was the initial framework I had, that the cops are going to try to criminalize everybody's problems. They're going to say, no, this person needs to go to jail. This is our jurisdiction. This is our case. And I thought that ambulance crews were going to try to medicalize people's problems. Like, this person's sick. This is our case. This is our problem to deal with. And I found that very rarely occurring. And that was far more common is that actually the police were trying to medicalize people's problems. They were saying, we don't want to deal with this person. We don't want to take them to jail because they're just drunk on the sidewalk. What we do is we summon the ambulance to then handle them. And then the ambulance crew wasn't trying to medicalize it. They were trying to demedicalize it. And I thought that Bordusian field theory was his questions of jurisdictional struggle and expansion, all that stuff, wasn't helping me make sense of it. And this is the moment which I thought labor would really help, like a labor process study. Because what it was really about was, or not, what it was primarily about is a protection of labor time, and a protection of workers' sense of vocation. So it was a constant process of theory and data. So my recommendation is take that proposal process real seriously, but don't be afraid to ditch it and think about it as one step on a long ladder towards the end of the dissertation. And I think it will all be worth it in the end.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was great.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd love to ask about what you're working on now.
What I'm working on now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in the middle of a second book project right now. Also under contract with the University of California Press. That's examining the frontline workers at the Los Angeles County Department of Public Social Services, which is one of the largest local welfare bureaucracies in the United States. And now it is just participant observation. So I didn't become a welfare caseworker. I didn't become a social worker, even like that. It was just participant observation, just shadowing these workers. In the context of what I talked about today, it's one in which I'm very cautious about understanding that because I didn't do the work, that there's a lot that was obscure to me. There's a lot that I don't understand about the subjectivities of the workers. There's a lot I don't understand about the general dispositions, and there's probably some backstage stuff that I don't know. But I think it's worthwhile to consider them in the context of what I just talked about. But it wasn't practical to become a worker. The opportunity never presented itself to me. It's not as if somebody said I could become a worker. And I don't think this organization would have ever embraced that. I was in a position where I began with the assumption that hybrid ethnography would be best, but I was really only given the opportunity to do participant observation. And what I've done now, and that one is mixed it with not subject participation, obviously, but mixed it with historical analysis. So I've been mixing my field work with archival research to better understand the labor process of these workers. So doing what Armando Larrañaga has recently called historically embedded ethnography, embedding one's field notes within a field of archival material. But it's a similar project that's looking at the frontline labor process among these street level bureaucrats in a welfare office. I don't know. I don't know when that will come out. Probably in 2025 or 2026, somewhere around there. But that's what I've been dealing with lately, at least.
Fascinating. All right, we've got just a couple minutes left. So if there are any last questions,
I see your comment, Jen. Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
I'm going to ask one more, which is field work, of course, and ethnography in general takes a huge personal commitment and amount of sort of deep engagement. And I think when I'm talking to PhD students, as they're just starting to begin to think about their theses, many are really curious about whether they're up for it and the depth, the trade-offs between more casual observation, interviewing, survey work, and then deep ethnography. And so I'm curious about, as you were beginning to think about your thesis work and moving in this direction, and obviously it went further than you had expected originally, but how you thought about those trade-offs and sort of the level of commitment to your field work.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I always knew I wanted to do a deep field study on this project. So it wasn't like I was considering the trade-offs between like interviews or something like that. Although that's a trade-off I'd be considering about the reset project, because like the welfare offices actually wouldn't let me in for very long. Just to come in for 6 months, but we don't really want you interrupting too much beyond that. So then it's done some post field work interviews. I think that when I started, I had already done field work in a prison. So my master's level project was basically a year of field work inside of a men's penitentiary in the state of Oregon. So I was already familiar what it entailed to do in-depth field work. And I was actually at that point really excited to go back and to begin the field work again. I think what I didn't predict that you begin to realize quick, and I don't predict this, it seems like very often, but then it ends up always hitting me right in the face. It's how embarrassing field work is. Like it's
Yeah.
it's emotionally exhausting because it's just, you're meeting new people, which can often present a lot of opportunities for embarrassment, but you're also a neophyte. You don't really know what's going on. So you're asking often silly questions. You're sometimes in an awkward position, especially if you're a participant observer, you're in like an awkward position of like shadowing people. So that's always one that sort of reminds, when I teach ethnography, I frequently sort of try to remind students of that, since I seem to forget it myself, is that there is this embarrassing part of field work that I've done quantitative research as well. And I've even done interviews, and there's something particularly embarrassing about doing field work that is just something you have to learn to tolerate or to stomach, because I just don't think that there's really a way to avoid it. And in addition to the time commitment, it's one that I tell students that you also have to consider that there's going to be um, some embarrassing moments and where you feel like you have to save face and all that stuff. So there's a unique time cost and a unique emotional cost that's worth considering.
Thank you for that. It's never been part of my reflections and advice before, but it will be from now on because it's completely true to my experience too. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you all for coming. The video will be up in a week. And yes, have a wonderful long weekend. Bye, everyone.
Take care, everyone.